But it was a cold autumn evening when Lucy received the unexpected call. Her aunt, who lived in the remote and mysterious Blackstone Manor in the north of England, had passed away. The manor, surrounded by thick woods, had always been a place of strange stories and eerie whispers. Lucy hadn't visited in years, but she remembered the old house well. As a child, she'd been terrified of the stories her aunt would tell. Stories of the house being cursed, of ghostly figures that roamed the halls at night, and of the strange things that happened in the dark corners of the house. The call informed her that she had inherited the manor. There was no one else left to claim it, and the authorities needed someone to take responsibility for it. After much hesitation, Lucy agreed to return to the manor and sort things out. The drive to Blackstone Manor was long and tiresome, with narrow, twisting roads and thick fog that seemed to follow her every move. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, but she shrugged it off as nerves. The manor itself stood on a hill silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its towering structure, with crumbling stone walls and overgrown ivy, looked more like a forgotten castle than a home. As she approached the front gate, the wind began to howl, sending a chill down her spine. Lucy stepped out of the car and gazed up at the manor, her heart racing. She had been warned about the place, but never truly believed in the supernatural tales her aunt had shared. But now, standing there, in front of the mansion, a sense of dread began to settle over her. Inside, the manor was dark, with only a few flickering lights to illuminate the massive hallways. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled old and musty. It felt as though time had stopped here long ago, and no one had dared to step inside for years. The house creaked and groaned as though it was alive, and Lucy could hear strange sounds coming from the upper floors. A door slammed shut upstairs, and she froze, listening intently. It was probably the wind, she told herself, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up anyway. "Hello?" Lucy called, her voice shaking. There was no answer. As she moved deeper into the house, she came across a large portrait hanging on the wall in the main corridor. It was a painting of a woman who resembled her aunt, but the eyes in the painting seemed to follow her. Lucy quickly turned away, trying to push the uncomfortable feeling aside. She made her way up the grand staircase, which seemed to creak with every step she took. The house seemed to grow colder the higher she went, and the air grew heavier. When she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed a door slightly ajar. Curiosity tugged at her, and she pushed it open. Inside was her aunt's bedroom, untouched by time. The bed was still made, and the curtains were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the moonlight. Lucy stepped inside, feeling the weight of the silence settle around her. She glanced at the vanity table and noticed a small ornate box that she had never seen before. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift when she looked at them. The box was locked, but Lucy felt a strange urge to open it. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and Lucy spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her, and she banged on the door, calling out for help. But there was no response. She turned back to the room, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath in the air. It was then that she heard it, soft whispers coming from the shadows. "Lucy, Lucy." The voice sounded like her aunt's, but it was distorted, almost as if it were coming from the depths of the house itself. She backed away from the door, her eyes scanning the room. The whispers grew louder, and she realized they were coming from the box on the vanity table. With trembling hands, Lucy approached the box and picked it up. The symbols on the surface seemed to glow faintly as she held it, and the whispers grew more frantic. "Open it, open it." Her fingers fumbled with the lock, and with a final click, the box sprang open. Inside the box, Lucy found a small, delicate key made of silver, its surface worn smooth by time. The key seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost like it was alive. A chill ran down her spine as she held it, unsure of what it unlocked, but knowing deep down that it was important. The whispers grew louder, now surrounding her from every corner of the room. She dropped the key back into the box and quickly closed it, her heart racing. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very walls of the room were closing in on her. Cold wind blew through the room, making the curtains flutter. Lucy turned toward the window. Through the glass, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure, standing in the garden below, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered clothes, with a face that was nothing but shadow. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. The figure was looking directly at her. "Who is that?" she whispered to herself. The figure raised a hand pointing directly at her and then slowly began to move toward the house. Lucy's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her body refused to move. She felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the shadowy figure that was drawing closer with every passing moment. Suddenly, the whispers intensified, now more like screams, echoing in her mind. The voices were familiar but twisted, her aunt's voice, pleading for help, mixed with other voices she didn't recognize, all speaking at once. It was as if the house itself was alive, calling out to her. Lucy stumbled backward, bumping into the vanity table. The box fell open again, the key still resting inside, gleaming in the dim light. She grabbed it this time, her hands trembling violently. There had to be something more, something she was missing. With shaking hands, she forced herself to focus on the key and then looked around the room. A strange feeling came over her, as though she wasn't alone. Her gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where a small hidden door stood, barely noticeable in the shadows. The door was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, but something about it seemed wrong. It wasn't supposed to be there. Unspeakable urge to approach the door. The whispers faded momentarily as she crossed the room, but the figure outside the window hadn't stopped. It was closer now, its distorted shape moving toward the manor at an unnatural pace. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached for the handle. It turned easily in her grip, and the door creaked open with a sound that made her jump. Inside, the room was pitch black, colder than the rest of the house, and smelled of something rotten. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and she was plunged into darkness. She could no longer see her hand in front of her face. Panic flooded her senses. She fumbled for a light switch, but before she could find one, the air shifted. A voice, low, raspy, and filled with malice, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." Lucy froze, her blood running cold. She knew that voice. It was her aunt's, but twisted, as though it had been warped by something ancient and malevolent. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The voice chuckled, and then the darkness shifted. A cold breeze brushed past her, and she felt a hand, icy and clammy, grip her arm. She screamed, struggling to pull away, but the grip only tightened. The darkness seemed to close in, suffocating her. The whispers started again, louder than before, filling her mind with visions of the past, the house's dark history, of tragedies, betrayal, and death. It was all connected to Blackstone Manor, the key, the box, her aunt's mysterious death, and the shadowy figure outside. "Let me go," Lucy screamed, but the hand didn't release her. Instead, she felt herself being pulled deeper into the darkness, her feet slipping out from under her as she was dragged towards something far worse than she could imagine. In the blackness, she finally saw it, something that made her blood run cold. A door, carved from ancient wood, standing in the center of the room. The door was sealed, but the key seemed to glow brighter, as if it were calling her to open it. The hand released her, and the darkness lifted just enough for her to see the door clearly. Her fingers shook as she approached it, the key heavy in her palm. She knew she had to open it, but part of her feared what she would find beyond. "Do it," the voice hissed, sending a shiver down her spine. "Open it, and you'll understand." With trembling hands, Lucy placed the key in the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that led downward, deeper into the earth. A cold wind rushed from the depths of the staircase, carrying with it the stench of decay. Lucy had no choice. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. As she descended into the darkness, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. And then, she heard something that made her freeze. A voice, weak and faint, echoing up the stairs. "Help me." It was her aunt's voice. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as she descended further. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew heavier, thicker with every step. She had to save her aunt. But the deeper she went, the more she realized that Blackstone Manor had a dark secret, one that no one was meant to uncover. Lucy's steps grew slower as she descended the stairs. The voice was still faint, but it was unmistakable. Her aunt's voice, weak and desperate, echoing from the depths below. The air grew colder with every step, and the oppressive silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She reached the bottom of the stairs, where the darkness seemed even thicker, impenetrable. The faint glow of the key was the only source of light, and it illuminated just enough for her to see the stone walls that surrounded her. The floor was damp, and the musty smell of mildew filled her nose. It felt like she was walking through the bowels of the earth. As she moved further into the underground chamber, the whispers grew louder. They sounded like more than one voice now, a chorus of people speaking in strange tongues. It felt as though the very air itself was alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. In the far corner of the chamber, Lucy saw a figure. It was her aunt, alive, or at least what was left of her. The woman stood motionless, her back to Lucy, facing a large, ancient-looking stone altar. Her aunt's hair was disheveled, and her clothes were torn, as though she had been here for years. Lucy called out to her, but the woman didn't respond. "Aunt Margaret?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. There was no reply. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the chamber, and Lucy felt the temperature drop even further. The air thickened, and something began to move in the shadows. Her heart raced. She had to get out of there, but her feet felt heavy, as though they were stuck in place, as though something unseen was holding her there. The figure at the altar turned. It wasn't her aunt anymore. It was a twisted version of her, eyes hollow and black as night, skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. A horrible grin spread across her face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Her aunt's voice came again, but this time it was distorted, filled with malice. "Lucy, you shouldn't have come." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Lucy took a step back, her mind racing. The whispers were all around her now, pressing in on her from every direction. "What have you done to her?" Lucy shouted, her voice shaking. Her aunt, or whatever it was, let out a low laugh. "It's not what I've done, it's what we all did," she sneered. "You see, this P-Place Blackstone Manor is cursed. We made a pact long ago, and now you're a part of it." The room seemed to close in around Lucy as she stood frozen, her eyes locked on the creature that had once been her aunt. The whispers were growing louder, like thousands of voices speaking in unison, each one filled with hatred, anger, and sorrow. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the shadows around her began to move, forming into shapes that twisted and writhed. Lucy backed away, heart racing. She felt like she was suffocating. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but all she saw were the shadows closing in. It felt as though the room itself was alive, and the very stones beneath her feet were pulsing with the dark magic that had been woven into the house long ago. Suddenly, the altar began to glow with an unnatural light, and the whispers became deafening. A deep, rumbling voice boomed from the shadows, as if the house itself were speaking. "It is time." Lucy's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. She wasn't just in the heart of the manor anymore. She was in the heart of something much darker. The ritual her aunt had mentioned, the pact that had been made, wasn't just some old legend. It was real, and it was calling to her. The creature that had once been her aunt stepped toward her, her eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. "You belong to the house now, Lucy," it hissed. "You will take my place. You will become one of us." Lucy's pulse thundered in her ears as she turned and ran toward the stairs. But no matter how fast she moved, the darkness seemed to follow her, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating shroud. The shadows on the walls reached out, grabbing at her, trying to pull her back into the chamber. "Lucy, you cannot escape," the voice of her aunt echoed in the darkness. "You are bound to this place." But Lucy refused to listen. She ran up the stairs, her breath ragged, her mind whirling. She had to get out. She had to escape. Just as she reached the top of the stairs, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was following her. She turned to look, but the hallway was empty. The house was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing. She stumbled back, and her foot hit something solid, a wall. But it wasn't a wall. It was the door she had entered through, the door that had led her to the basement. It was closed now, and the key she had carried with her had vanished. Panicking, Lucy tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She screamed in frustration and fear, pounding on the door with her fists, but there was no answer. She was trapped. She turned around, looking for another way out, and then she saw it, an old mirror, hanging on the wall. It was cracked, but it still reflected her image. As she stared into it, her own reflection began to distort. Her face twisted, contorted with fear, and the shadows in the room seemed to crawl toward her reflection, pulling her into the glass. "Lucy," the reflection whispered, its voice not her own but something far darker. "It's too late." Before she could react, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. Lucy screamed as the room seemed to collapse around her, the darkness swallowing her whole. As the shards of glass scattered around her feet, Lucy stumbled backward, her mind racing. The room seemed to twist and bend, the walls pulsing with a dark, unnatural energy. The shadows, no longer just figures in the corner, came alive, reaching out with spectral hands, dragging her closer to the shattered mirror. A cold, otherworldly laughter echoed through the air, surrounding her on all sides. Lucy felt the floor give way beneath her, as though the house itself was consuming her. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat, choked by the suffocating darkness that filled the room. And then, everything went still. The shadows receded, and the laughter faded. The oppressive pressure that had been pressing on her chest vanished. For a moment, Lucy felt an eerie calm settle over her. But as she opened her eyes, she realized she wasn't in the hallway anymore. She was standing in a vast, empty space. There were no walls, no floors, just an endless void stretching out before her. A figure stepped out of the darkness. It was her aunt, or at least it looked like her. Her skin was still pale, her eyes black as coal, her mouth curled into that same twisted grin. "It's done," the figure said, its voice low and filled with a sickly satisfaction. "You are part of the house now, Lucy. You've joined us." Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back. "What do you mean? What's happened to me?" The figure laughed again, a cruel, hollow sound. "You've crossed the threshold. You are bound to Blackstone Manor now, forever." Lucy looked down at her hands, feeling them tremble. They were no longer hers, at least, not entirely. Her skin had grown pale, the veins beneath it darkened, as though she were becoming something other than human. "You were chosen," her aunt's figure whispered. "The pact is complete." Lucy's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the words, but it was clear now. Her aunt hadn't just been possessed by something dark, she had become part of it. And now, so would Lucy. As the realization sank in, she felt herself being pulled toward the figure. Her body moved against her will, drawn by the house's malevolent force. The shadows wrapped around her like chains, binding her to the same fate her aunt had suffered. There was no escape. "Welcome to Blackstone Manor," her aunt's figure said, her voice echoing through the void. "You will never leave. None of us ever do." Lucy wanted to scream, to fight against the force that was consuming her, but it was no use. The shadows began to swallow her whole, pulling her into the same dark, cursed eternity that had claimed her aunt. As the last of her consciousness faded, she felt the cold embrace of the house take her completely. The whispers of those trapped within the manor surrounded her, now joining her in their endless torment. And in that final moment, Lucy realized that the house wasn't just alive, it was a prison. a prison for all who had dared to enter, and one that could never be escaped. And so, Blackstone Manor grew darker, its curse continuing to spread, its inhabitants lost forever to the shadows. My name's James, and I'm a builder by trade, living in the heart of London. But the story I'm about to tell you didn't happen in the city. It happened in a quiet village just outside of town, a place called Holloway. I never thought I'd believe in ghosts, not really. But after what happened to me, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when my company was hired for a major restoration project. The job was supposed to be straightforward, just some repairs to an old manor house, nothing too fancy. But when I first saw Holloway House, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the house itself, but something about the air around it. The wind didn't move the trees in the yard, and the birds seemed to stay away. I told myself it was just the place being so old, maybe even a bit eerie, but deep down, I knew something wasn't quite right. The house was massive, tucked away on a hill surrounded by thick woods. It had been abandoned for years, its windows dark and the door weathered and creaky. It looked like something out of a storybook, something you wouldn't want to go near at night. When we arrived for the job, it was late afternoon. My crew and I parked in front of the house, our tools and equipment ready to go. I led the team up the long, cracked driveway. As I reached the front door, I hesitated for a second. The door was large and made of old oak, with iron handles shaped like twisted vines. It looked like it hadn't been opened in ages. I knocked, and after a moment, the door slowly creaked open, revealing a thin, pale man. He was the owner, a Mr. Holloway, who had inherited the house from his grandparents. He'd been living abroad and finally decided to restore the house to its former glory. "We've been waiting for you," Mr. Holloway said in a low voice, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He seemed odd, distant, almost as if he were distracted by something. I thought nothing of it at the time, though. We got to work the very next day. I had no idea that the peaceful silence of the house would turn into a nightmare that would follow me for months. The first few days were normal enough. We began by clearing out the rooms, taking down the rotting wood panels, and replacing the old roof. But the more we worked, the stranger things started to feel. It was little things at first, tools that would go missing, then turn up in places we hadn't been. I'd hear soft whispers, but when I turned around, no one was there. Then came the first real incident. One night I stayed late to finish some work in the library, a room full of ancient books and dusty furniture. The others had already left, and the sun had set. As I was packing up my things, I heard a loud bang from the other side of the house. It was so sudden, so sharp, that I froze in place. I wasn't sure whether to investigate or to just leave. Curiosity got the best of me, and I made my way through the dark hallways, holding my flashlight tight. The air grew colder as I walked, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer with every step. When I reached the source of the noise, I found nothing. Just an empty room, no sign of anything being out of place. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly left the room. The next day, I mentioned it to the others, but they all just laughed it off. They said it was probably a raccoon or some other animal, but that night, things got worse. The next night, I stayed a little later than usual, trying to wrap up some paperwork in the office just off the main hallway. The sun had long since set, and the house was quiet, eerily quiet. My workers had left, and Mr. Holloway hadn't been around for days, claiming he was handling some legal matters in town. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, the kind of quiet that felt suffocating. The old wood floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked from room to room, double-checking that everything was secured for the night. I was just finishing up when I heard it again, a soft whisper like a breeze. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. I stood frozen, listening closely. It wasn't just the wind, it was clear words, though I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no answer. I waited for a moment, hoping it was just the house groaning again, but then I heard it. Footsteps. slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the hall. I had no idea who could be in the house. Everyone else had left hours ago. I grabbed the nearest tool, a crowbar, just in case. My heart was racing as I crept through the darkened hallways, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped in my tracks. There, standing at the top of the staircase, was a figure. A woman dressed in a long, old-fashioned gown, her face hidden in the shadows. I could barely make out her features, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and piercing. I took a step back, trying to steady myself. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I knew what I saw. "Who are you?" I shouted, but the woman didn't respond. She simply stood there, not moving, as if waiting for something. Suddenly, she turned and walked down the hallway, vanishing into the darkness. I stood frozen, the flashlight still trembling in my hand. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Was it a trick of the light? Maybe I was just exhausted. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Someone had been in the house. The next morning, I told my crew about what I'd seen. They laughed it off, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. But after that night, things started to happen more frequently. More strange noises, more missing tools, and more unexplainable events. But it wasn't just the house that felt off. It was Mr. Holloway, too. He was acting even stranger than before, almost as if he were avoiding us. When he did show up, he would only linger in the background, watching us with a look in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. One afternoon, I decided to confront him. I found him sitting in the sitting room, staring out the window, lost in thought. "Mr. Holloway," I began, trying to sound casual. "Is everything all right? You seem different lately." He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was quieter than usual. "The house. It's been in my family for generations. There are things about it, things I can't explain. I didn't want to tell you, but I think it's time you know." I was confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. Mr. Holloway stood up slowly and turned to face me. "This house, it's not just old, it's cursed. My family has tried to leave, tried to sell it, but something always brings us back. Every generation has been touched by it, haunted by it in some way. I thought I could fix it, but I can't. It's too late." He paused, his face pale. "You should leave, James. It's not safe here." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I thought he was just losing his mind. But after everything I had experienced in the past few days, I wasn't so sure anymore. Something dark was happening in that house, something ancient. That night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't just walk away without knowing the truth. I needed to know what was really going on. I stayed up late that night, determined to uncover whatever secret the house held. The air was colder than usual, and the silence pressed heavily on my chest as I moved through the dark hallways, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't stop. I had to find out the truth. I returned to the library, the room where I had first felt the strange presence. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside, the air thick with dust. I scanned the room, looking for anything out of the ordinary. That's when I noticed the large, faded portrait hanging on the far wall. It was a painting of a man who looked remarkably like Mr. Holloway, but there was something about the painting that made my stomach turn. The man in the portrait wore a dark suit, his eyes cold and lifeless, just like Mr. Holloway's. But what caught my attention was the date on the bottom corner of the frame, 1842. It was an old portrait, but that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that the man in the painting looked exactly the same age as Mr. Holloway, no older, no younger, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a regular house. This wasn't just an old abandoned mansion. This was something far worse. The house had a history, and not a good one. I turned away from the painting, my mind racing, and that's when I heard it again. Whispers, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to be coming from behind the bookcase on the far wall. I approached cautiously, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping over me. I grabbed the edge of the bookcase and gave it a gentle push. To my surprise, it moved. Behind the bookcase, there was a small door half hidden from view. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle and pulled it open. What I found on the other side made my blood run cold. It was a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether I should go down, but curiosity got the better of me. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were damp, and the smell of mold and decay filled the air. It felt like I was descending into the bowels of the earth. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small stone chamber. The walls were lined with old, weathered bookshelves, and there was a strange altar in the center of the room. It was made of dark stone, covered in ancient symbols I couldn't recognize. But what really caught my attention was the large, ornate book lying open on the altar. I walked up to the book and began to read. The text was written in a language I couldn't understand, but the more I looked at it, the more the words seemed to twist and change. It felt as if the book was alive, shifting before my eyes. I couldn't tear myself away. The whispers in the room grew louder, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone or something was coming down the stairs. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispers had stopped, and the room was silent once again, but the feeling of being watched never left me. And something I hadn't noticed before, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil. She was staring directly at me, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She didn't move, but I could feel her presence, like she was waiting for me to make a move. Without thinking, I grabbed the book and slammed it shut. The moment I did, the room seemed to explode with noise. The walls shook, the floor cracked beneath my feet, and the shadows around me twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes. I could hear screams, whispers, and the sound of something heavy dragging across the stone floor. I had to get out. I ran back up the stairs, my heart racing. As I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the house behind me. I never went back to Holloway House. The next morning, I left the village and never looked back. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I later heard from the locals that the house had been abandoned once again. Mr. Holloway had disappeared, and no one had seen him since the day I left. Some said he'd gone mad, while others believed that whatever was haunting the house had claimed. As for me, I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I'll never forget the whispers in the dark, the cold touch on my shoulder, and the eyes that followed me wherever I went. The house, the land, and whatever else was tied to it, they were all cursed. And the truth is, I was lucky to escape with my life.